Nobody believed the sound was real. They said it was the wind slipping through cracked concrete, or loose sheet metal tapping in the dark, or the kind of thing old buildings do when they settle into decay. But on the third night in a row, at exactly 2:17 a.m., Gunnery Sergeant Mason Reed heard it again. 3 slow knocks from somewhere deep behind the east wall of the abandoned Harlan textile plant. Mason had spent 12 years in the United States Marine Corps, most of them listening for sounds other people missed. A shift in gravel under boots, the soft click of metal under pressure, the difference between wind and warning. This was not wind. The plant sat 20 miles outside Flagstaff, Arizona, surrounded by scrub brush and open land that stretched wide beneath a cold November sky. The temperature had dropped to 34 degrees, and frost clung to the chain-link fence like a thin layer of silver. Mason stood alone in the gravel lot, collar of his canvas jacket turned up against the dry desert air, breath rising in steady clouds. He had taken the security job 2 weeks earlier after leaving active duty, telling himself it was temporary, something quiet, something without memory. The pay wasn't much, just enough to cover rent on his 1-bedroom apartment and keep the lights on. The place was scheduled for demolition in 10 days. His job was simple: keep trespassers out, log anything unusual, wait for the bulldozers. But the building didn't feel empty. Inside, the air smelled like rust and damp insulation, a stale mixture of old fabric dye and time. Moonlight filtered through broken skylights 30 feet overhead, casting pale beams across dust that drifted like slow snow. Mason moved down the corridor with a heavy-duty flashlight in hand, boots echoing softly against concrete. He paused when he reached the east wall, the one patched unevenly years ago with cinder blocks that didn't quite match the rest. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence and the faint hum of wind outside. Then it came again. Knock. Pause. Knock. Knock. Not loud. Not frantic. Measured. Deliberate. Mason's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, pressing his palm flat against the cold block. The surface felt solid, unmoving, but beneath his hand he sensed something else, an almost imperceptible vibration, like breath trapped behind stone. He swallowed slowly. "I hear you," he said under his breath, voice calm, steady, the same tone he once used in darker places across the ocean. He didn't know what he expected in return. Another knock followed, weaker this time, but there. 3 taps, as if answering him. Mason took a step back and angled the flashlight beam along the seam where old mortar had begun to crumble. A faint draft slipped through a hairline crack, carrying with it a scent he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years. Not mold, not dust, something warmer, familiar. His heartbeat shifted, not faster, just deeper. He reached up and unclipped the worn dog tag he still carried around his neck, running his thumb over the embossed letters out of habit. Ghost. He murmured into the hollow dark, unsure why the name surfaced now. Outside, a pickup truck passed on the distant highway, its headlights sweeping briefly across broken windows. Inside, behind concrete and silence, something shifted. And then, softer than before but unmistakable, came the sound of a single breath waiting to be remembered. The air inside the plant felt different after that last breath, as if the building itself had been holding something back for years and had finally decided to let one witness hear it. Mason kept his hand against the wall for a long moment, counting silently the way he used to before stepping into uncertain ground. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. Then a faint scrape, low and dragging, followed by a soft exhale that barely reached through the mortar. He angled the flashlight closer, tracing the uneven line where newer cinder blocks met older concrete poured decades ago. The mortar there had thinned, hairline cracks webbing outward like veins. He crouched, pressing his ear to the cold surface. The concrete stole the warmth from his skin, but beneath it he caught something fragile and steady. Breathing. Slow. Controlled. Not wild. Not panicked. Waiting. Mason stood and stepped back, scanning the corridor out of habit, as though expecting someone to explain what he was hearing. The plant was empty. No vagrants. No teenagers looking for trouble. Just dust, silence, and that measured presence behind the wall. He walked to the supply locker near the loading dock and retrieved a small pry bar and a hammer, tools left for securing loose panels. He hesitated before returning. The demolition crew had given strict instructions not to alter structural sections before inspection. Breaking through could cost him the job. He looked down at his boots, at the fine layer of gray powder settling along the leather. He had followed orders his entire adult life. He also knew when something mattered more than a rule written on a clipboard. Back at the east wall, he set the flashlight upright on the floor so the beam washed across the blocks in pale white. "Easy," he said quietly, not certain who the word was meant for. He tapped once at the mortar seam with the hammer. The sound echoed hollow in a way solid concrete never did. Another soft scrape answered from within. Mason froze, breath catching in his chest. There was no doubt now. Something alive was behind that barrier. He shifted his grip and wedged the pry bar into a weakened crack, applying slow, careful pressure. The mortar flaked away in dry crumbs, falling to the floor in small gray piles. Each movement he made was deliberate, controlled, the way he had learned to move around anything fragile. He paused often, listening between motions. The breathing continued, faint but steady. Not the chaotic rhythm of fear, but the endurance of something that had learned to conserve strength. A thin draft slipped through the widening gap, carrying a scent stronger now, unmistakable. Not just warmth. Not just life. Fur. Dust. Time. Mason's throat tightened. He widened the opening another inch, enough for a thin shaft of light to slide through the darkness beyond. For a moment he saw nothing but shadow. Then two reflections appeared in the beam, low to the ground, still, watching him without a sound. He did not move. Neither did they. The silence between them felt older than the building itself, heavy with years no one had counted. "I am here," Mason said softly, the words steady, almost reverent. Behind the broken seam, the breathing deepened, and for the first time, he saw the faintest flick of movement where a tail might have been, brushing once against unseen concrete, as if answering a call that had taken 3 years to reach its destination. The light trembled slightly as Mason adjusted the flashlight, widening the gap just enough to see beyond the surface of shadow. The eyes did not blink away. They held steady in the beam, amber dulled by dust, yet unmistakably alive. He eased another block loose, careful not to let it fall hard against the floor. The opening widened to nearly 12 inches across, and a thin body shifted forward within the narrow chamber. The space behind the wall was no more than 3 feet deep, a forgotten service cavity left between structural layers when the plant had been renovated decades ago. It was never meant to hold anything living, and yet something had endured there. Mason knelt slowly, lowering himself to eye level. What he saw tightened something deep in his chest. A German shepherd lay pressed against the inner concrete, coat once sable now faded and thinned by time, ribs faintly visible beneath fur that had grown uneven and matted. Dust clung to his muzzle. His ears, though lowered with exhaustion, still carried a familiar shape. The dog did not growl. He did not retreat. He simply watched Mason with an expression that was neither fear nor surrender. It was recognition without certainty. Mason exhaled carefully. "Easy, boy," he murmured, voice steady. The same tone he had once used in the early mornings before patrol. The dog's nose twitched, catching the scent that had drifted through the crack. Military soap. Leather. Steel. Memory. A faint movement followed, slow and deliberate. The tail brushed the concrete once more. Mason reached one hand through the opening, palm facing down, offering space instead of force. He did not rush. He waited. Seconds stretched long enough to feel like years. Then the dog shifted forward another inch, lowering his head just enough to press his nose lightly against Mason's fingers. The contact was brief, fragile as paper, but real. Mason swallowed hard. "Ghost," he said quietly, the name settling into the space between them like something sacred. At the sound, the dog's ears flicked. Not sharply, just enough. Mason leaned closer, angling the flashlight to catch the collar around the dog's neck, hidden beneath thickened fur. The leather was cracked and stiff with age, but a small metal plate remained attached. He brushed dust aside with trembling fingertips and tilted it toward the light. The engraving was worn but readable, property of United States Marine Corps. Beneath it, a name stamped in clean capital letters. Ghost. Mason closed his eyes for a moment. 3 years earlier, during a joint operation in the Middle East, Ghost had gone missing after a structural collapse separated units during evacuation. They searched for days. Nothing. The report had listed him as lost in action. Mason had carried that weight home heavier than his own gear. Now here he was, breathing in the dark behind a wall no one thought to question. Mason opened his eyes and looked at him fully, not as a rumor, not as memory, but as living proof that some bonds refuse to end quietly. "You waited," he whispered, the words barely louder than breath. Ghost's gaze did not waver. He shifted his weight, attempting to stand, but his legs trembled beneath him. Mason immediately withdrew his hand and stood. "Do not move," he said gently, as if the dog could still take commands. He moved with controlled urgency toward his truck parked outside the loading dock. Within minutes he returned with bottled water, a clean blanket, and a folding utility knife to carefully widen the opening without collapsing the structure. Each block he removed felt like peeling back years of silence. With the gap now nearly 2 feet wide, Mason set the blanket down on the dusty floor and reached in again, this time sliding one arm carefully beneath Ghost's chest and the other under his hind legs. The dog was lighter than he should have been for his size, but there was strength still in the way he leaned into Mason's shoulder. As Mason lifted him slowly into the open air of the corridor, Ghost rested his head against the fabric of Mason's jacket, eyes closing not in defeat, but in trust, as though the long night behind the wall had finally ended. The corridor felt less hollow once Ghost was no longer sealed behind concrete, as if the building itself had exhaled with him. Mason carried the German Shepherd carefully across the dusty floor, each step measured so the dog would not feel the sway of imbalance. Ghost's body was light, too light for a full-grown working dog, yet there was still density in his shoulders, the memory of strength resting beneath frailty. Outside, the November air cut cool and clean against Mason's face as he pushed open the loading dock door with his back. The desert night stretched wide beyond the chain-link fence, stars scattered sharp and bright across a black Arizona sky. He laid the blanket down in the bed of his pickup truck and eased Ghost onto it, keeping one steady hand along his ribcage, until he was sure the dog was settled. For a moment, Ghost's paws trembled against the steel surface, unfamiliar with open space after years confined to 3 narrow feet of darkness. Mason placed his palm gently against Ghost's neck. "You are safe," he said quietly. The words were simple, but he spoke them like a vow. He twisted open a bottle of water and poured a small amount into the cap, holding it near Ghost's muzzle. The dog hesitated only briefly before lapping in slow, careful motions, conserving energy even now. Mason watched every movement, searching for signs he remembered from long ago, alertness in the ears, awareness in the eyes. They were still there, dimmed but unbroken. He reached into the cab and grabbed an old fleece jacket from the passenger seat, draping it lightly over Ghost's back to shield him from the 38-degree night air. The plant stood silent behind them, its broken windows reflecting faint starlight like empty eyes. Mason pulled out his phone and checked the time. It was nearly 3 in the morning. The nearest emergency veterinary clinic was 24 miles away in town. He slid into the driver's seat but did not start the engine right away. Instead, he turned halfway in his seat so he could see Ghost through the rear window. The dog's head rested against the blanket, eyes half closed yet tracking Mason's silhouette. "You held on," Mason murmured. All this time, the engine came to life with a low rumble, and the headlights cut across gravel as he eased onto the empty highway. The road was quiet, stretching long and silver under the moon. Every few seconds, Mason glanced in the rearview mirror. Ghost remained still, breathing steady, chest rising and falling in quiet rhythm. Mason's mind drifted back to the day Ghost had been declared missing. The reports, the silence that followed, the folded leash placed in a storage locker with no explanation. He had told himself to accept it, to move forward. Yet something inside him had never fully agreed. Now, as mile markers slid past, 1, 2, 3, he felt the weight of those years shift. Not erased, not forgotten, but changed. The dashboard clock glowed faint green as they approached the edge of town. A sign ahead announced the exit toward Route 66 Veterinary Emergency Care. Mason tightened his grip on the steering wheel, not out of fear, but determination. He had followed orders when the mission ended. Tonight, he followed something older than orders. In the truck bed, wrapped in blanket and memory, Ghost lay beneath the open sky for the first time in years, breathing air that did not taste like concrete. And somewhere between the quiet hum of tires on asphalt and the steady rhythm of a dog's heartbeat, Mason felt the first fragile thread of redemption pull taut between them. The fluorescent lights inside Route 66 Veterinary Emergency Care hummed softly as Mason carried Ghost through the glass doors just after 3:30 in the morning. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh coffee, a contrast to the dust and concrete that still clung to his jacket. A young veterinary technician looked up from behind the counter, her expression shifting from routine calm to quiet concern the moment she saw the condition of the dog in Mason's arms. "We need help," Mason said, his voice steady but low, not urgent in panic, but firm in purpose. Within minutes, they guided him into an exam room where stainless steel tables reflected the bright overhead lights. Mason laid Ghost gently onto the padded surface, keeping one hand resting along his side until the technician assured him they would take it from there. Ghost did not resist. He watched Mason as if measuring distance, as if confirming he was not being left behind again. A veterinarian in her early 40s entered quickly, introducing herself as Dr. Elaine Porter. Her movements were efficient, practiced, yet gentle as she began her assessment. She listened to Ghost's chest, checked his eyes, examined the worn collar. "He is severely dehydrated and malnourished," she said carefully. "But his heart is strong. Very strong." Mason nodded once, absorbing each word like a report in the field. "He has been surviving on something," she continued. "Likely water from condensation or leaking pipes. It is remarkable." Mason exhaled slowly, almost a silent prayer. Ghost's breathing remained steady, though shallow, as they placed an intravenous line for fluids. Mason stood near the wall, arms folded loosely, resisting the instinct to intervene. He had learned long ago that trust sometimes meant stepping back. After several minutes, Dr. Porter glanced at him. "You said his name is Ghost?" Mason swallowed before answering. "Yes, ma'am." She studied the collar again, then looked back at Mason with quiet understanding. "He has the will of a working dog. That alone makes a difference." Mason stepped closer to the table once the initial treatment was underway. He reached out and let his fingers rest lightly against Ghost's shoulder. The dog's eyes shifted toward him, and though exhaustion weighed heavy, there was clarity there now. Recognition no longer uncertain. Mason leaned in slightly. "You are not on your own anymore," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Ghost's tail moved once against the table, a faint but deliberate motion. Dr. Porter offered a small nod. "The next 24 hours will matter. But I believe he wants to be here." Mason allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile, the kind that came without effort. Outside, the eastern horizon had begun to soften from black to deep blue, the first signs of morning creeping across the desert sky. Through the narrow clinic window, he could see the edge of dawn rising over distant mesas. It felt symbolic, though he would never say that aloud. He remained beside the table as fluids flowed and warmth slowly returned to the body that had endured years of darkness. The mission had changed, but the objective was clear. Stay, protect, do not leave. And as the steady beep of monitoring equipment filled the quiet room, Mason realized that this was not a rescue born of chance. It was the completion of something unfinished, carried quietly through time until both man and dog were ready to find each other again. Morning arrived slowly through the narrow clinic windows, pale light stretching across tile floors and stainless steel counters as the night staff rotated out and the day shift stepped in. Mason had not slept. He remained seated in the corner chair beside Ghost's recovery kennel, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped as though still waiting for a briefing. The steady rhythm of the intravenous fluids had slowed, and the color had begun to return faintly beneath Ghost's fur. His breathing was deeper now, less fragile, though exhaustion still weighed heavily on his frame. Dr. Porter entered just after 8 o'clock, holding a tablet with updated readings. She offered Mason a measured look, the kind professionals use when balancing realism with hope. "He made it through the night," she said gently. Mason nodded once, absorbing the words with quiet gravity. "His organs are responding. That is significant. There will be a long recovery, but he is fighting." Mason stood and approached the kennel as the door was opened. Ghost lifted his head slightly at the sound of his boots on the tile. The movement was small, but deliberate. Mason crouched, lowering himself so they were eye level again. "That is right," he murmured. "You always were stubborn." Ghost's ears shifted at the familiar tone, and though his body remained weak, there was awareness in his gaze now, sharp and steady beneath fatigue. Dr. Porter explained the next steps: gradual refeeding, careful hydration, monitoring for complications. Mason listened with the same focus he once reserved for operational details, committing each instruction to memory. "Will he remember training?" Mason asked quietly. The doctor considered the question. Working dogs carry instinct deep. Muscle memory returns. Trust returns faster. Mason let that settle. Trust. It had survived concrete and years of silence. He reached through the kennel bars and rested his fingers lightly against Ghost's paw. The contact was warmer than it had been hours earlier. Outside, the town had fully awakened. Traffic moved along the highway. A school bus passed in the distance. Ordinary life continuing, unaware that behind clinic walls, something long thought gone had been found again. Mason stepped outside briefly to make a call to the demolition supervisor, informing him he would not be returning to the plant that day. The supervisor sounded irritated but said little. Mason ended the call without apology. Some absences matter more than employment. When he returned inside, Ghost's eyes followed him immediately, tracking his movement with unmistakable intent. Mason felt it then, the shift from rescue to reunion. He was no longer pulling a stranger from ruin. He was standing beside a partner who had endured beyond reason. He pulled his dog tag from beneath his shirt and let it rest in his palm, the metal catching the morning light. "We are not done," he said softly. Ghost's tail moved once against the kennel floor, stronger than before. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was a quiet declaration that survival had not been accidental. It had been chosen, one breath at a time. And as the clinic filled with the steady sounds of a new day, Mason understood that some bonds do not break when walls close in. They wait, patient, steady, until someone listens close enough to hear them again. By the third day, the clinic no longer felt like a temporary stop between crisis and outcome. It had become a quiet proving ground. Mason arrived before sunrise with black coffee in a paper cup and the same steady expression he once carried into early briefings. Ghost was no longer confined to the intensive kennel. He lay on a padded recovery mat near the back window where the morning light filtered in soft and gold. The intravenous line had been removed, replaced by small, measured meals spaced hours apart. Dr. Porter explained that too much too quickly could overwhelm a system that had learned to survive on almost nothing. Mason listened, nodding once, committing each instruction as if it were field protocol. When he approached, Ghost lifted his head without hesitation. The movement was stronger now, intentional. Mason crouched and held out his hand, palm open. "You are coming back," he said quietly. Ghost's nose pressed into his fingers with more certainty than before. There was weight behind it now, muscle memory returning in small increments. A technician walked by and smiled. "He watches the door every time it opens," she said softly. Mason allowed a faint breath of acknowledgement. He always did. Later that afternoon, Dr. Porter encouraged Mason to try a brief assisted stand. The clinic floor had been cleared, and a towel was slid gently beneath Ghost's midsection for support. Mason positioned himself at the front, one hand steady along the dog's shoulder. "On me," he murmured, voice calm and grounded. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Ghost shifted his weight forward. His front paws pressed against the mat, legs trembling under strain. Mason did not rush. "Take your time," he said. Ghost pushed again. Slowly, deliberately, he rose halfway before faltering. Mason tightened his support, but did not lift fully. This was not about carrying. It was about remembering how to stand. After several seconds that felt longer than they were, Ghost steadied on all fours for a brief, fragile moment. The room fell silent. No applause. No celebration. Just the quiet gravity of something restored inch by inch. When Ghost settled back down, exhausted but alert, Mason rested his forehead lightly against the dog's. "That is it," he whispered. "That is enough for today." Outside, the Arizona sky stretched bright and cloudless, 70 degrees by mid-afternoon. Life moved forward beyond the clinic walls, but inside that small room, progress was measured not in miles but in inches. Dr. Porter reviewed new blood work and returned with cautious optimism. "He is responding better than expected," she said. Mason absorbed that without outward reaction, but something inside him eased. He had spent years carrying the unanswered weight of a partner lost without closure. Now, each small movement rewrote that ending. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the clinic floor, Mason sat beside Ghost with his dog Tag resting against his chest. He spoke softly about things no one else in the room could understand. Training runs at dawn, desert air thick with dust, commands given in low tones. Ghost listened, ears shifting at familiar cadences. Not every word mattered. The tone did. The presence did. And as the sun dipped beyond the mesas and clinic lights flickered on, Ghost's tail moved again, not from instinct alone, but from recognition. It was no longer survival guiding him. It was belonging. 1 week later, the clinic doors opened not for emergency, but for departure. The morning air outside was clear and cool, 58 degrees under a pale Arizona sky, and sunlight spilled across the parking lot in long, quiet beams. Mason stood beside Dr. Porter as she reviewed the final discharge instructions, her tone steady and thorough. Gradual exercise. Controlled feeding. Follow-up in 7 days. Mason listened with the same disciplined attention he had shown since the first night, committing each detail to memory without the need to write it down. Ghost stood at his side now, lean but upright, a new harness fitted carefully around his chest where the old collar once rested. The fur along his back still bore uneven patches, but his posture had changed. There was structure in it again. Awareness. When the clinic door opened and a rush of outside air brushed across his face, Ghost paused. Not from fear. From processing. The world was wide after years measured in inches. Mason crouched slightly, resting a hand against Ghost's shoulder. "It is all right," he said quietly. Ghost stepped forward. The movement was deliberate, cautious, but steady. His paws touched pavement, then grass at the edge of the lot. He lowered his head briefly, inhaling scents carried on open wind, dust, gasoline, distant pine. Ordinary things. Living things. Mason guided him toward the pickup truck parked beneath a faded Route 66 sign. He had folded a thick quilt across the back seat this time, refusing to let Ghost ride in the truck bed again. As he opened the door, Ghost hesitated only a second before placing his front paws on the seat and pulling himself up. The effort was visible but controlled. Mason supported lightly, allowing Ghost to complete the motion on his own. When he settled onto the quilt, he turned once, positioning himself so he could see Mason clearly. Dr. Porter stepped closer and offered a small nod. "He chose to stay," she said softly. Mason understood what she meant. Survival alone did not explain everything. Mason closed the truck door gently and moved to the driver's seat. As the engine started, he glanced sideways. Ghost's head was lifted, ears angled toward the windshield, watching the road ahead as if already anticipating direction. The clinic faded in the rearview mirror as they merged onto the highway. This time, the drive felt different. Not urgent. Not heavy. The sky stretched open above them, bright and without obstruction. Mile markers passed slowly. 1, 2, 3. No longer measuring distance from loss, but distance towards something unfinished yet possible. Mason reached across briefly and rested his hand against Ghost's harness. The dog leaned into the touch without hesitation. No command was given. None was needed. The road curved gently west toward Mason's small apartment on the edge of town, a place that had felt temporary before. Now it carried a different weight. As sunlight filled the cab and the desert rolled wide beyond the windows, Mason felt the quiet certainty that some missions do not end with paperwork or reports. They wait in silence, patient as breath, until someone returns to listen. And beside him, no longer hidden behind walls or shadow, Ghost watched the horizon with steady amber eyes, not as a memory restored, but as a partner stepping back into daylight. The apartment felt smaller than Mason remembered when he opened the door that afternoon, sunlight cutting across the hardwood floor in long, quiet stripes. It had always been a temporary space, a place to sleep between shifts at the plant, walls bare except for a single framed flag and a shelf that held more dust than decoration. Ghost paused at the threshold, nose lifting as he studied the unfamiliar scent of detergent, coffee, and clean air. Mason stepped inside first and knelt, resting, a hand against the floor. "Come on," he said softly. Ghost crossed the doorway slowly, paws moving with care, nails clicking lightly against the wood. The sound echoed in the quiet room, not hollow this time, but alive. Mason had cleared a corner near the window earlier that morning, laying down a thick dog bed and a folded blanket. He guided Ghost toward it without pulling, without pressure. The dog lowered himself onto the cushion with controlled effort, exhaling once as his body settled into something softer than concrete. Mason stood and walked to the kitchen, filling a stainless steel bowl with fresh water and setting it nearby. Ghost drank steadily, not desperate, not frantic, but measured. When he finished, he lifted his head and scanned the room again, ears turning at the distant hum of traffic outside. Mason moved quietly, placing his keys on the counter, setting his dog tag on the table where afternoon light caught its edges. For a long moment, he simply stood there watching Ghost breathe. The rise and fall of his chest was stronger now, deeper. Not survival alone. Recovery. Later that evening, when the temperature dropped to 62 degrees and the sky beyond the window turned amber with sunset, Mason opened the back door that led to a small fenced yard. It was not large, barely 20 feet across, bordered by chain link and desert gravel. Ghost stepped outside cautiously, nostrils flaring as the open air wrapped around him. The scent of sagebrush drifted on a light breeze. Mason walked beside him, not leading, just present. After a few careful steps, Ghost paused and looked up. Mason gave a slight nod. "Go on." Ghost moved forward another few feet, testing his legs, then another. His gait was still uneven but improving. At the edge of the yard, he stopped and lifted his head toward the wide Arizona horizon visible between neighboring rooftops. For a moment, he simply stood there, ears upright, tail resting low but steady. Mason recognized the posture. Alert, grounded, watching. He felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized was still clenched. Night settled gradually, stars emerging one by one above the dark outline of distant mesas. Mason remained outside with him long after the last light faded. He did not speak much. Words were not required. Ghost returned to sit beside him, pressing lightly against Mason's leg, not from weakness, but from choice. Mason rested his hand against the dog's back, feeling warmth beneath his palm. The yard was quiet except for the faint rustle of desert wind. No walls, no concrete, no silence that had breath. Just open sky and two figures standing where they were meant to be. And as the first cool edge of night deepened around them, Mason understood that home was no longer defined by square footage or furniture. It was defined by the presence beside him, steady and alive, under the same wide American sky. The first week at home moved in careful increments, measured not by hours, but by progress. Mason adjusted his routine without announcement, rising at 6 each morning as he had for years, though there was no formation waiting and no plant shift to report to. Instead, there was a quiet apartment filled with soft breathing and the faint scrape of paws against hardwood. Ghost had begun to anticipate the rhythm. When Mason stepped into the kitchen and poured water into the stainless steel bowl, the dog lifted his head before the sound was finished, ears angling forward with renewed alertness. His coat had begun to regain its sheen, darker sable tones returning beneath careful grooming and balanced meals. Strength built slowly, visible in the way his legs no longer trembled when he stood. That Saturday morning, with the temperature already climbing towards 75 degrees under a clear Arizona sky, Mason clipped the new leash to Ghost's harness for their first walk beyond the yard. He did not rush the moment. He simply opened the door and waited. Ghost stepped forward without hesitation this time, crossing the threshold as though it had always been meant for him. The sidewalk stretched quiet along the residential street, lined with low stucco homes and desert landscaping. Mason kept his pace slow, matching Ghost's stride. Each step was deliberate, but no longer fragile. Neighbors glanced up from watering shrubs or collecting mail, their expressions shifting from curiosity to quiet admiration as the German shepherd moved beside Mason with calm dignity. There were no dramatic displays, no commands barked across distance, just presence, a partnership re-established in silence. Halfway down the block, Ghost paused and looked up at Mason, ears upright, eyes bright beneath the sun. Mason gave a subtle nod, the same acknowledgement he once offered before crossing uncertain ground. Ghost resumed walking, posture taller now. The world had expanded from 3 feet of darkness to open streets, warm air, and distant mountain outlines against the horizon. When they returned home, Mason filled a shallow basin with cool water and let Ghost rest in the shade of the small yard. He sat beside him on a simple wooden chair, boots planted firmly on the ground, watching as the dog lowered himself with controlled ease. "You remember," Mason said quietly. Ghost's tail moved once against the gravel, steady and assured. Later that afternoon, Mason placed a folded American flag patch onto the harness, not as decoration, but as acknowledgement. Ghost did not react to the gesture, but his gaze remained steady as Mason's fingers adjusted the fabric. The sun began to dip toward evening, casting long shadows across the yard. Mason leaned back and allowed the stillness to settle. The plant had been demolished 2 days earlier. Concrete reduced to rubble, walls erased, yet what had waited behind them now rested openly at his side. As dusk cooled the air to 68 degrees and stars began to appear, Ghost rose on his own and stood beside Mason, looking outward beyond the fence line toward the wide desert sky. There was no uncertainty in his posture, no question of where he belonged. Mason rested his hand along Ghost's back, feeling the quiet strength beneath for restored. The mission had shifted from rescue to rebuilding, from survival to purpose. And beneath the open sky, where no walls stood between them, man and dog faced forward together, not toward memory, but toward whatever waited next. By the second week, the rhythm between them no longer felt fragile. It felt earned. Each morning began before sunrise, when the desert air still held a cool edge around 60 degrees, and the sky hovered in that quiet space between night and light. Mason would lace his boots slowly, the familiar pull of leather grounding him, while Ghost watched from the edge of the living room rug, head lifted, eyes clear. There was no urgency in the room, only readiness. When Mason reached for the leash, Ghost stood before the metal clip made contact with the harness. He did not tremble anymore. He did not hesitate. Outside, the world was waking. A distant truck shifted gears on the highway. A neighbor's porch light clicked off. The mountains beyond, Flagstaff, carried a faint pink glow along their ridges. Mason and Ghost moved down the sidewalk in step, not perfectly synchronized yet, but close. Mason tested a quiet command under his breath. "Heel." Ghost's ears flicked back briefly, then forward, and he adjusted his position until his shoulder aligned with Mason's knee. It was not sharp. It was not drilled. It was remembered. Mason felt the weight of that memory settle gently rather than heavily this time. At the park 2 blocks away, he led Ghost to a wide patch of grass still damp with morning dew. He unclipped the leash but kept his posture steady. "Stay." Ghost held position. Not rigid. Focused. Mason took 5 steps back, then 10. "Come." The dog moved forward with controlled energy, stride lengthening naturally, stopping inches from Mason without collision. Mason allowed the smallest hint of pride to surface, the kind that does not need applause. Around them, joggers passed with headphones in, unaware that something quietly extraordinary was unfolding in the open air. Ghost had once been reduced to inches of darkness. Now he crossed yards of grass under open sky. Later that afternoon, Mason drove them toward the edge of town, where desert trails stretched wide and unpaved. The temperature had risen to 82 degrees, but a light breeze kept the heat manageable. Mason stepped out of the truck and looked across the red earth and scattered brush. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood. Ghost stepped beside him, tail level, eyes scanning the horizon. Mason removed the leash once more and placed a hand against Ghost's neck. "Search." The word carried history. Ghost moved forward, nose lowering toward the ground, gait purposeful. He did not sprint. He assessed. Mason watched the posture return fully now. The balance, the awareness, the quiet confidence that defined a working dog. When Ghost circled back and sat squarely in front of him, waiting for the next instruction, Mason knelt and rested his forehead lightly against Ghost's. No medals, no ceremony, just acknowledgement. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the desert floor. As they returned to the truck, dust clinging lightly to boots and fur, Mason understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before. This was not merely recovery. It was restoration. Not to what had been, but to what still could be. And as Ghost settled into the passenger seat, eyes steady and alert, Mason saw not the years behind them, but the road ahead, open, unguarded, and wide beneath the American sky. 3 weeks after bringing Ghost home, Mason stood in front of the small Veterans Outreach Center on the edge of town, the morning sun warming the pavement to nearly 70 degrees. The building was modest, brick faded by years of Arizona heat, a simple American flag moving gently above the entrance. Mason had not visited since leaving active duty. He had told himself he did not need the support, that silence was easier. But as he adjusted the harness on Ghost's back, smoothing the patch that bore the quiet emblem of service, he felt something different settle in his chest. Not reluctance, readiness. The glass door opened and a middle-aged man stepped out, leaning slightly on a cane, his expression cautious but curious as he noticed the German shepherd standing tall at Mason's side. Ghost did not strain against the leash. He did not bark. He simply observed, posture calm, ears attentive. Mason offered a brief nod and guided Ghost inside. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and old books, a few folding chairs arranged near a bulletin board layered with notices and handwritten flyers. Conversations softened when Ghost entered, not out of fear, but recognition. A working dog carries a presence that does not need explanation. Mason felt it too, the weight of quiet acknowledgement in the room. He moved toward a table where a small group of veterans sat in conversation. No speeches were made. No introductions were necessary. Ghost approached one man slowly, head level, tail steady. The man reached down with a hesitant hand, fingers brushing against thick sable fur. Ghost leaned gently into the touch. The man's shoulders, tense only moments before, lowered by degrees. Mason watched without interruption. This was not training. This was instinct. Ghost shifted from one person to another, never overwhelming, never demanding. Simply present. In that room, beneath fluorescent lights and faded photographs of past service, something passed quietly between them all. Shared understanding. Shared memory. Later, as Mason stepped outside into the open air, he felt the difference. The road ahead no longer seemed undefined. He had spent years believing that what was lost could not return. Yet here stood Ghost, breathing warm desert air, offering steady contact to hands that trembled less after touching him. Mason rested his palm along Ghost's neck, feeling strength beneath fur that once lay hidden behind concrete. "You still serve," he said softly. Ghost looked up at him, amber eyes clear and certain. The wind moved lightly across the parking lot, carrying the scent of dust and distant pine. Mason understood then that restoration was not only about muscle regained or distance walked. It was about purpose found again in unexpected places. As they walked back toward the truck, the American flag above the building caught a stronger gust and unfurled fully against the sky. Mason paused briefly, hand rising instinctively in quiet respect. Ghost stood beside him, posture aligned, gaze forward. There were no walls now. No shadows to conceal breath. Only open ground beneath them and a path that stretched beyond recovery into meaning. And as they stepped into that wide Arizona sunlight together, the bond that had endured years of silence moved forward once more, not defined by what had been lost, but by what had been restored. Autumn settled deeper over Flagstaff as the weeks passed, the air turning crisp in the early mornings and the scent of pine growing sharper along the edges of town. Mason stood in his small backyard one evening, the temperature hovering near 60 degrees, the sky painted in streaks of amber and violet as the sun lowered behind distant mesas. Ghost moved across the yard with quiet strength, no longer tentative, no longer measuring each step. His coat had thickened, sable fur catching the last light in warm tones, and his stride carried the confident rhythm of a working dog who had reclaimed his ground. Mason watched him in silence, hands resting lightly on the fence rail, feeling the weight of the past not as burden but as distance traveled. The demolition site where concrete once stood was now a flattened stretch of dirt beyond town, nothing remaining but memory. Yet what had been hidden behind those walls now stood openly beneath a wide American sky. Ghost trotted back and stopped beside Mason, sitting squarely at his left without command. Mason glanced down, offering the smallest nod of acknowledgement. It was enough. The desert wind moved gently through the yard, stirring dry grass and brushing against fur that had endured years of darkness. Mason reached down and ran his hand slowly along Ghost's back, feeling muscle firm beneath his palm. "You waited," he said softly, not as a question, but as recognition. Ghost's tail moved once, steady and assured. There were no cameras here, no ceremony, no applause. Just the quiet presence of two lives that had intersected again at the right moment. Inside the apartment, the framed flag caught the reflection of fading light. Mason had placed Ghost's restored collar beside it on the shelf, not as a relic, but as reminder. Survival had not been loud. It had not demanded attention. It had endured in silence until someone listened closely enough to hear breath behind stone. As twilight deepened and the first stars emerged, Mason stepped away from the fence and walked toward the open gate. He did not close it immediately. Ghost remained seated for a heartbeat longer, then rose and followed, shoulder aligning naturally with Mason's knee. They moved together without leash, without command, stepping beyond the yard toward the quiet street, where streetlights flickered on one by one. The road ahead was not dramatic. It was simple, pavement stretching forward under steady light. Mason understood now that some stories do not end in triumph. They end in grace, in the knowledge that what was once lost can be found not through force, but through faithfulness. He rested his hand once more against Ghost's neck as they paused beneath the glow of a street lamp. The air was cool, steady, alive. And beneath that wide sky, where no walls stood between them and tomorrow, man and dog faced forward together, not defined by the years of silence, but by the quiet miracle that brought them home.